Oh, okay. Da musst du ausschalten. Okay, so the second try, I'm very sorry to let you wait. Thank you very much, Hossam, for the presentation. So as the title of my presentation said, I will try to present to you some considerations about the field of Theological Hadith Studies. And I would like to begin this presentation with a known hadith cited in Muslim Sahih in the Book of Repentance, and the chapter on the virtue of constant dhikr, pondering of the hereafter, and remembering that God is always watching, on the permissibility of relenting that sometimes in attending to worldly matters. So I will read the hadith in Arabic, and you have an attempt of translation here. So, An Hanzala al-Usaydi قال وكان من كتاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال لقيني أبو بكر فقال كيف أنت يا حنظلة قال قلت نافق حنظلة قلت يكون عين الله وسلم يذكرنا بالنار والجنة حتى كأن رأي عين فإذا خرجنا من عند رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عفسنا الأزواج والأولاد والضيئات فنسينا كثيرا. قال أبو بكر فوالله إنا لنلقى مثل هذا. فانطلقت أنا وأبو بكر حتى دخلنا على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. قلت نافق حنظلة يا رسول الله. فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وما ذاك؟ قلت يا رسول الله تكون عندك تذكرنا بالنار والجنة حتى كأن رأي عين فإذا خرجنا من عندك عفسنا الأزواج والأولاد والضيئات نسينا كثيرا. فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والذي نفسي بيده إن لو تدومون على ما تكونون عندي وفي الذكر لا سفحتكم الملائكة على فرشكم وفي طرقكم ولكن يا حنظلة ساعة وساعة 3 مرات. Next, please. So why I am beginning with this hadith is because I believe that this hadith is representative of a certain understanding of hadith, or at least it allows us to develop some insights or to enough transmission. And secondly, to gain insights into the distinctive task of theological hadith studies. And why is that? Because I think that it shows how the hadith is first of all the testimony of an experience. Because Hanzala testified that when we are in the company of God's messenger, he makes us ponder over hellfire and paradise as if we are seeing them with our very eyes. And when we leave God's messenger, we attend to our wives, our children, our business, and we become forgetful of most of these things. Abu Bakr, the foremost companion according to Sunnism, confirms this experience. And it obviously troubles them both that the state of consciousness produced by this experience leaves them when they leave the company of the Prophet. But the answer of the Prophet again confirms the exceptional and extraordinary character of this experience. Being in the presence of the Prophet and assisting at the prophetic proclamation is not an everyday or ordinary experience. When prophetic proclamation happens, something extraordinary happens. The mention of the angels expresses very well the intervention and presence of the supernatural and transcendent order of reality. It is this transcendent quality which, according to the Prophet's explanation, induces the contemplative awareness and understanding of eschatological realities described by Hanzala. the very eschatological images the Quran mentioned become a lived reality, something which is perceived directly. Historical time is somehow abolished and absorbed into eternity. There are several other traditions which articulate how the companions, that is, the very sources, and in a certain sense, the authors of the hadith, experience the prophetic proclamation, as shown, for example, by Danny Greele in his studies on the attitude of the companions towards the prophet, according to the hadith and the Shira, which is described through the known expression as if there were birds on their heads. What the companions transmit through the hadith, then, is not a simple report relating a natural event, but it is a testimony of the experience of the prophetic proclamation, as it occurs through the prophet's words, acts, his simple appearance and presence. The hadith is then the testimony of the encounter with the Prophet Muhammad as proclaimer of God's revelation. So what are we dealing with when we deal with a hadith? And what does a hadith want to be? A report, an epic narrative, a historical document, a normative record? As a social linguist Pierre Larcher has shown, the term hadith, according to its word root, denotes both an event and the narration of an event. So what is actually characteristic of the hadith as a text is this unity of event and narration. The event does not exist independently of the narration, or it becomes recognizable as an event through the narration. So the narrativity and the resulting perspective are already inherent and assumed in the hadith itself. At this time, the narration is and again in a performative way when the narration is passed on and transmitted and performed. The hadith, however, obviously claims to be more than the narration of an event. This is shown from the textual both form the testimonial nature of the hadith is constitutive for it as a text, as shown in an exemplary way in this hadith, in the hadith of Hanzala, but also in every other hadith, I would argue. The textual characteristics of the hadith are formally those of a religious testimony. There is a witness whose identity is part of the text, as far as the hadith is always both the matan, that is the original text, and the isnad, so the documentation of the transmission. The matan is introduced by a classical formula of testimony. I was, or we were in the presence, we heard, we saw, etc. But there's something more to the unique character of the hadith as religious testimony. It is a transmitted testimony, and its transmission is actually part of the hadith's text. Again, a hadith is always matan and isnad. So a specific characteristic of the hadith is thus its condition of being the object of transmission. Culturally and historically, unique for the hadith is that the documentation of the transmission, transmission path, i.e., who transmitted it, and the process of transmitted, that is, how it was transmitted, is part of the hadith text itself. This gives meaning to the statement that the hadith is a transmitted testimony. The repeated watching of the testimony and what is witnessed therein forms an integral part text, which is represented by the text. Thus, in addition to the person appearing in the testified event and the witness, also an actor and author of the hadith. As a consequence, the hadith is not simply a testimony from a past time. It can only be made to speak by reconstructing constructing it historically. The hadith, as it were, see to speak to the community, and thus also claims to be heard anew by every generation. So there would be a lot to say about this aspect of transmission, but I would like to confine myself here to the testimonial nature of the hadith in order to develop a perspective for theological hadith studies as an academic field. So the question I would like to address in this presentation is the following. What does this insight about the testimonial nature of the hadith, the academic study of hadith, does this insight feel? This interrogation firstly regarding of science, the epistemology of testimony, and these. If we is transmitted testimony is studied, we can distinguish seeks to preserve and make accessible in the form of testimonies handed down in the form of
because you are out from here.
Okay. In the form.
Just the camera, but you are not.
Okay. So I'm trying to. So let's start again then. So what classical hadith scholarship is concerned with them is the event of revelation of the prophetic proclamation, which it seeks to preserve and make accessible in form of testimonies handed down in order to make this proclamation present. As John Burton summarizes this quite aptly when he states that, I cite, the significance of the tradition of hadith is thus the sense that it preserves the prophet alive in the midst of the believer, available still to be consulted on any and every question. In this light, Muhammad's death became irrelevant. So the aim of the sciences of the hadith can be resumed very rapidly as the preservation of the sunnah to trustworthy textual transmission. There's obviously, again, a lot to say about this, but let us consider now the second approach, which is the approach of Islamic studies or Orientalism and religious studies in modern academia. Obviously, the aim here is not the preservation of the Sunnah. The Hadith is not considered under the same conditions and in view of the same results. In fact, Islamic studies consider the Hadith from very different presuppositions, which have been discussed amongst others by Jonathan Brown in his book on Hadith of 2009. The Hadith is studied in Islamic studies primarily as a historical document that provides information about the time of the origin of Islam or about Muslim society. Historical research does not really study the Hadith for its own sake, but as a resource or as a source for researching the origin of Islamic law, the history of theological currents and schisms, the political history of the Islamic world, or the history of Quranic exegesis. The extent to which the Hadith tradition is historically authentic reflects the extent to which it historically reflects the activity of the Prophet has been the subject of very controversial discussion in Islamic studies since the late 1970s. also also no position has been able to establish itself in a strong way. Jonathan Brown distinguished here roughly between a revisionist approach, which represents a radical skepticism towards the usefulness of the Hadith as a historical source, and a re-evaluation approach, which takes the Hadith tradition seriously as a historical source and considers most of it reliable. In the meantime, however, the dividing line runs between positions that consider a definite clarification of the authenticity of Hadith possible, and those that assume that this is only true for a rather limited part of the Hadith corpus, indeed only for some individual Hadith. But the dating of Hadith, however, remains the goal of historical critical research. Since the late 1980s, approximately, another approach has emerged, strongly influenced by the rise of cultural and social science methods, and more recently by linguistics and literature, the study of science of literature. Here, the Hadith is increasingly studied on the basis of its reception history as a cultural heritage, allowing insight into social practices, cultural networks, discourses of legitimation, etc. The textual form of the Hadith is also now increasingly scrutinized in order to understand it as a literary production and a genre in its own right. The question of authenticity, which can be neither definitely nor unequivocally clarified, is explicitly excluded in this approach in order to allow sociological, cultural, and historical perspectives, and to create insight into central areas of Muslim society. But whether historical critical, whether the history of reception, or more cultural and social approaches, Islamic scholarly Hadith research, or the research on Hadith in Islamic studies, works with a methodological naturalism that implies a more or less applied methodological doubt. While naturalism seeks to grasp reality as something that can be explained by purely natural and empirically ascertainable factors, this doubt is based on the Cartesian assumption that only doubt leads to sure knowledge, or to the knowledge of the truth of a fact. And therefore, the truthfulness of information must first be doubted in order to be able to judge it scientifically. For the treatment of the Hadith in Islamic studies, this results in premises that can be formulated as follows. So you can see here in the PowerPoint. So the first one being that God does not intervene in history, or that it is scientifically irrelevant whether he does, because God's action is not a historical explanation for historical phenomena, and therefore not for prophetic action and its transmission. Secondly, that Muhammad is a historical figure and thus an actor in history like any other actor. It can therefore be assumed that he acted according to the same motives as non-prophetic people or actors. An explanation of his actions and decisions must therefore refer to the worldly and possibly personal interests that were achieved through these actions. Similarly, the Muslim account of the prophetic action, that is, for example, the Hadith, must also be examined in terms of the worldly interest it served by. The teachings and charisma of a religious founder or renewer are institutionalized by certain interest groups in the form of a canon, and therefore lead to the formation of power structures that enable the manipulation of religious authority, which emanates from the control of this canon. So the authenticity of tradition is therefore to be doubted until the opposite can be proven or at least made plausible. And finally, the last assumption, the epochs of the human history do not differ in a qualitative way, because history has neither a higher sense nor a goal. Therefore, the same psychosocial laws apply to all phases of history and societies. And historians who live in the 21st century under completely different conditions can therefore nevertheless infer from their own world of experience the motives of the actors in the history of the origin of Islam. So if one compares this with the parallel assumptions of the classical Hadith sciences, it becomes clear why a perspectival differentiation between the concerns and the methodologies of both disciplines is necessary. The classical Hadith sciences do not only function differently and aim at something different, they derive above all from theological postulates that are based, that determine their view on transmission, on tradition, on history, and on truth. And that determine their vision from the reference to revelation. Thus, the Sunni Hadith tradition assumes that, firstly, divine action of revelation motivated and determined the actions of the Prophet Muhammad. Secondly, that the period in which the revelation of the Quran and the prophetic proclamation occurred had a unique salvific quality, and thus also an exemplary significance. That thirdly, the unadulterated preservation of revelation is divinely and prophetically guaranteed, and therefore the tradition of revelation is to be trusted in principle until proven otherwise. And lastly, that the Sahaba, in virtue, that is the companion or the source of the Hadith, that the Sahaba, by their suhbah alone, by their companionship of the Prophet, are reliable and trustworthy witnesses of the prophetic proclamation. So that the transmission and tradition that invokes and proceeds from them is fundamentally trustworthy, unless there are proven reasons to doubt it. And lastly, sorry, this is the last point, the second point, the fifth point, that history up to its eschatological end is determined by progressive decadence, which results from the progressive temporal distance from the event of revelation and the accompanying alienation from it. And this is actually which established the function of the Hadith transmission and tradition and science, as well as religious significance as tactile preservation of this original and true Islam as it was taught and lived by the Prophet Muhammad. But with regard to the testimonial nature of the Hadith, there is an important difference between the two approaches. And it is very interesting to refer to the discussion about the epistemology of testimony in contemporary philosophy. As, for example, Benjamin McMillan explains in his book, Testimony, Trust, and Authority, and in his chapter, Testimony as a Philosophical Problem. Our modern view of testimony is biased by the Enlightenment suspicion towards the testimony as source of knowledge. So today's philosophical epistemology distinguishes between three sources of knowledge of fact. Firstly, direct perception of fact. Secondly, interference from fact. And thirdly, testimony of fact. And an important point of the Enlightenment project was to individualize knowledge and to emancipate it from mediating instances. As a result, testimony was considered to be an inferior form of knowledge. Trusting testimony, that is a form of knowledge that is mediated and therefore based on social cooperation, on epistemic responsibility, and interpersonal relations, is considered, I cite McMillan, intellectually naive or somehow epistemically irresponsible. So the contemporary discussion about testimonial knowledge brought to light that we fail to understand that testimonial knowledge is based on social interaction, on epistemic responsibility and trust. And I would argue, in fact, that Islamic study refuses somehow but out of a methodological necessity to recognize the testimonial nature of the hadith. It attempts, in fact, to turn the hadith into a different type of source. Because this is how Islamic studies must proceed in order to fulfill its own criteria of valid methodologies and results. In particular, the historically critical approach is a product of the Enlightenment epistemology, but also in different ways, anthropological and sociological approaches, which are, of course, legitimate, but insufficient. As a consequence, our scientific understanding of the hadith is one-sided and incomplete. It suffers from reductionism. To put it very simple, how can we understand, if we ignore the testimonial nature of the hadith, how can we understand what hadith means to Muslims? Why hadith continues to mean something to Muslims today, despite the modern loss of confidence in canonical culture described by Jonathan Browns, and the problem of authenticity raised by Islamic studies? And how does the hadith continue to mean something to Muslims, or why it sometimes doesn't? So, returning to the hadith of Hanzala, classical hadith scholarship, as in the case of Muslim, the author of the Sahih, is concerned with the quality of its transmission and its exegesis. For example, the relation between adat and ibadat, so everyday actions and acts of worship, possibly also with its normative, dogmatic, and spiritual implications. But it is not concerned with its academic analysis in the modern sense, and how the hadith can be academically explained in a secular and pluralistic society. Islamic studies, on the other hand, would consider the problem of historical authenticity. It would consider the political, social, and cultural implications of the hadith. For example, how the hadith of Hanzala legitimizes a certain prophetology, possibly for the advantage of a certain social or political milieu, or how it affirms the religious authority of Abu Bakr, or how certain milieu in contemporary Islam use this hadith in order to affirm a certain agenda or identity. So these considerations on the hadith as testimony show, I would argue, that there is an academic and in fact also a social need for an approach to hadith which is able to take the testimonial nature of the hadith seriously, while at the same time fulfilling the requirements of modern academic research. So there is, I would argue, there is the need for an academic instance which is able to understand both intellectual cultures, both approaches, okay, the approach of classical hadith studies and the approach in Islamic studies, and then which is able to mediate between them, as well as between the Muslim horizon of religious experience and the secular society. And this leads me to the next point, the need for theological hadith studies. So if Islamic studies, if the approach of Islamic studies to hadith represents a secular and non-confessional approach to hadith, this is an approach, in fact, which is characteristic of society in the West, of a secular and plural society. As a consequence, it is indispensable for Muslim intellectuality in the West to understand this approach and point of view, and to be able to be in a constructive and critical dialogue. At the same time, Islamic study needs an interlocutor who academically understands and represents the community's view of Islam. Let me explain this a little bit further by considering shortly what Islamic theology is from a point of view of the theory of science. There are different ways of considering what Islamic theology as an academic discipline means and how it works, how it is to be considered. So one way is to distinguish between an external and an internal approach to Islam. So while Islamic studies is studying Islam from the exterior, as from a non-confessional point of view, so that it doesn't matter if the studying subject has a confessional relation to the object he's studying. Islamic theology represents an internal approach. It's trying to understand Islam from the interior. So this is a quite, let's say, plausible way of considering it, but there are some problems with it. The first one is that also Islamic studies claims in some cases to have access to the interior, to an interior understanding of Islam, so the understanding of Islam from the point of view of the actors themselves. So, for example, in interpretive anthropology. And at the same time, Islamic theology is also concerned with the exterior point of view. It has to be, in order to be an academic field, okay? It has to be able to consider its object of study with distance, okay, with a certain distance and from the exterior. So this distinction, internal and external, might be useful, but it doesn't maybe explain sufficiently what Islamic theology is about. Another distinction, which is from Reinhard Schulze, a German scholar of Islamic studies, is that in Islamic studies, Islam is merely an object of study, while in Islamic theology, it becomes also an active subject of study. So this is a useful distinction, I think, because it explains very well, or it integrates the distinction between internal and external, but in a more precise way, I would say. But still, it is not, I think, the best way to consider it, because what is distinctive for Islamic theology is, I think, its reference to revelation. And revelation in the case of Islam, which is represented by the Quran and the Sunnah. So there's another way of considering academic theology, which is from Christoph Schwöbel, who explains theology as a form of rationality, of an academic form of rationality, which is dialogical, so which is in dialogue with the other sciences, interdisciplinary, in dialogue with the society, in the secular society in which academic theology is practiced, but a form of rationality which is founded on revelation, or which is developed on the basis of revelation. So this just to give you some impression, okay, what might be the background of the theological study of Hadith. So, returning to the question of the testimonial nature of Hadith, this would mean that, or the other way around, what would this mean with regards to the Hadith as a transmitted testimony from an academic point of view? What does it mean for a theological understanding of the Hadith as a testimony in a secular and pluralist society? And how can this lead to disclosing the Hadith as a resource for Muslim life and thought in a secular and pluralist context, which would be the aim, as we will see, of the theological study of Hadith. So let us, in order to try to address this question, let us now look more closely into what it means to consider the Hadith as a testimony from the point of view of theological Hadith studies. First, we have to ask what constitutes the Hadith as testimony, and what is it that is testified to in the Hadith? How and for what purpose is testified to? And finally, how the testimony can be made accessible in such a way that what is testified to can become academically plausible in its theological significance and understandable in a social context determined by naturalistic worldview. So what results theologically from the testimonial character of the hadith, from the testimonial nature of hadith. In the hermeneutics of testimony, Ruggero philosophically discussed the particular nature of testimony and in particular of religious testimony. Here, in this case, biblical, prophetic, and the New Testament. But what is interesting for our concern is the hermeneutical perspective on the particular nature of religious testimonies, as Ruggero precisely elaborates it on the basis of a semantic analysis. He distinguishes a quasi-empirical from a quasi-forensical dimension of testimony, which are both common to the profane testimony, so to the non-confessional or non-religious use of the notion of testimony. The hadith is, in fact, and this is interesting also for our concern, because it shows that the hadith is very often reduced to this quasi-empirical dimension, both in research and to a considerable extent also in contemporary Muslim discourse. It is constantly considered, examined, and evaluated as a historical document. The question of the extent to which the hadith reports an empirically verifiable event, so the question of the hadith's usefulness as a historical source for the time of the emergence of Islam, thus becomes the central problem. And also the quasi-legal or forensic dimension of the hadith also occupies a large place in contemporary discourse around the hadith, whether in research or among Muslim public. The hadith is primarily discussed here as a source of law, as evidence for normativity. So both uses, or use of the testimony, in fact, corresponds, according to Ruggero, to a profane vision of testimony. So in this way, the hadith is not considered as a religious testimony. So according to Ruggero, what constitutes a religious testimony is the unity in the testimony of the narration of an event whose credibility is based on the authority of the witness, and the testimony as the confession of meaning, which is testified to as a truth. This unity of event and meaning certainly applies to the hadith. For in it, an event is witnessed, but an event in which a person is an actor whose prophetic claim is also witnessed. One would even have to say that the hadith testifies to the fact that the actual actor in this event is a transcendent subject, namely God's act of revelation. The meaning that is testified to in the hadith thus consists in the fact that the reproduced event has the meaning of an event of revelation and proclamation. In the hadith, therefore, it is not only the event of the action, speech, agreement, or appearance of an historical actor that is testified, but also, and above all, the prophetic meaning of this event. The above mentioned commitment to truth of the witness refers here not primarily to the authenticity of the testimony in the modern sense of historicity, but to the religiously meaningful and sense-giving content of the testimony. That is, the meaning that is testified to here on the basis of an event is a truth that is significant beyond the contextual and contingent meaning of the event. However, it does not follow from the unity of event and meaning that the hadith is to be regarded only as a fictitious narrative. The hadith claims to be testimony to an event that truly took place. Only it is not reduced to the report of the historical fact of this event. The hadith is not historiography in the conventional sense, and certainly not in the modern sense. For the history narrated here is not the history of natural and ordinary events. It is the history of revelation, and thus also the history of salvation. The history of God's act of revelation and salvation through the mission of the Prophet Muhammad and the Islamic community. As already mentioned, events and meaning are to be understood as a unity in the testimony. Ruggero, of course, did not deal with hadith and consequently could not discuss the aspect of transmission, which, as already mentioned, is unique for the hadith in this form. In this context, transmission means that the event narrated in the testimony and the meaning of this event attested as truth is vouched for by other persons who themselves did not participate in the event, but only knew its witnesses. The transmitters vouch for the trustworthiness of the guarantee with their personality, which is why the critique of the transmitters and the trustworthiness plays an important role in the classical hadith science and criticism. On this basis, let us try to penetrate a little deeper into what is testified in the hadith. When a testimony testifies to an event and a meaning and confess it as truth, it is indeed first testifying to an experience. So we recall the example of the hadith handler, which I believe is in many ways interesting for this concern of testimony. So the testimony is ultimately the testimony of the witness's experience. His experience of an event that signified for him the meaning of a truth. But what is the relationship between the religious experience of the witness and the testimony of it? The philosopher of religion and theologian Richard Scheffler has dealt with the problem of the relationship between experience and testimony and has stated, I cite, experience is always the result of an encounter between reality and the way in which people have possessed in which people have appropriated this reality through the forms of their viewing, of their consideration and thinking. So this is Scheffler, which means that also the witness speaks of his experience. It is not merely a matter of communicating the content of an experience, as Scheffler explains in a further citation. I cite, the specificity of testimony, and especially of religious testimony, is a matter of communicating something that goes beyond conventional and ordinary contents of experience, and of standing up for the fact that this is a reality that concerns not only the witness himself, but also other people. So this other which happened to the witness of the hadith, and which he advocates before his hearers, or which he testifies before his hearers, is the reality and truth of the prophecy of Muhammad. And this is, I would argue, what is ultimately and fundamentally brought up in the hadith. This is what the hadith is actually about, as a testimony. Provided, of course, that the hadith is considered to be trustworthy. So the meanings, the ma'ani, and the words, the alfaz of the hadith express this reality linguistically, and thus the prophetic truth, which the person of Muhammad represents on the basis, in virtue of revelation, which is expressed amongst others in the two Quranic verses I'm citing here. Verily, a messenger has come to you with the truth from your Lord. So here the notion of haqq. And in other words, those who believe in what has been sent to Muhammad, and it is the truth, or the reality from the Lord. So it is this truth that is fundamentally addressed in the hadith, which is testified, or which is experienced by the witnesses and then testified, as also a well-known tradition exemplified. So here, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As came to the Prophet to ask his opinion about writing down hadith and said, should I write down everything I hear from you? The Prophet said, yes, even when you are well pleased or when you are in anger. He further asked, and the Prophet said, yes, because in all these states I only ever utter the truth, or the truth, haqqan. So of course, there's much to say about this. I just wanted to give some examples. So in summary, it can be said that hadith is testimony to an experience of the prophetic reality or of the prophecy of Muhammad expressed in an event. The Prophet speaks, acts, appears, is present. And in the hadith, the witness confesses that this event is an event of revelation and proclamation. The one who speaks, acts, etc., is the messenger of God. The reality that the witness of the hadith has experienced and of which he bears witness, and which he confesses as truth, is, however, only recognizable to man through the Quran in its religious and eschatological significance. So how does the Quran reveal the reality experienced by the witness of the hadith, and to which he bears witness before his hearer? So just to give some examples, the reality of Muhammad's prophecy is revealed in the Quran as grace for all worlds, as calling to God with his permission, calling to that which makes you alive, as herald of glad tidings and warner, as the shining light, who does not speak out of desire, as a servant who has seen from his Lord the mighty signs, who commands them, so the believers, what is right and forbids them what is reprehensible, who permits them what is good and forbids them what is evil, and who takes away from them their burden and the fetters that will open them, who recites to them his signs and purifies them, and teaches them the scripture and wisdom. Also they were before in manifest error. A messenger who suffers when you are in distress, caring for you, kind and merciful to those who believe, and who finally is raised up by his laws to a rank of praise. So this is the Quranic prophetology, which discloses what the prophet represents in a religious sense. And as Stephen Spurl shows, a specialist of Arabic literature, this Quranic prophecy is actually present in every hadith, as it was interpreted and understood by the community. So if somebody says, Qala Rasulullah, this prophetology is narrated and attested and confessed as a sort of narrative background of the hadith. And it is present in every hadith. So the reality of Muhammad's prophecy, based on revelation and unavailable to the human mind, human cannot know by himself. I mean, this is the Asherite point of view, cannot know by himself the dignity and reality of prophecy. So this reality, which takes place in the event of proclamation, is experienced, witnessed and known by companions, represents in the hadith the other. That constitutes, according to Scheffler, the religious testimony. And this is what the hadith is ultimately about. Why do we take it seriously as a religious testimony? So the theological study of hadith has the task of making this testified other, the reality of the prophecy of Muhammad, as testified by the witness in the hadith, to make this other academically comprehensible in the hadith. So it is crucial that this other is not considered separately from the testimony, because this carries the danger of projecting one's own subjective ideas onto this other. So this is not about an abstract idea, about an abstract philosophical idea or concept, but about what one encounters in the personal encounter with the Prophet Muhammad. And this is what the companions bear witness to in the hadith. The testimony is, after all, the testimony of a living and concrete experience. And our comprehension of the other, however, cannot be derived on a rational level, like a philosophical idea, for example. And it is therefore conditioned by the testimony and thus by the experience of the witness. As Scheffler puts it, the listener can only know the event in the way it was experienced, and the experience only in the way it was witnessed. So a testimony is always relational. It refers to a present or future group of people because you testify to somebody, to a present or future group of people whom the witness had in mind when he testified. He is, after all, being witness to someone. And if we consider the quasi-forensic character of the testimony, we understand that the witness is also defending the truth he confesses. In religious testimony, the meaning of the witnessed event is defended as truth by the witness, just as the witness does in a court of law. However, in the Hadith, the witness defends the truth of the meaning he has experienced before the judgment of his contemporaries and before the judgment of the world, but also of the judgment of the Prophet himself, and ultimately before the eschatological judgment of God. So the witness of the Hadith knows that he or she is placed in this salvation historical context when he or she bears witness and watches for it with his or her personal integrity. Therefore, his or her testimony is also a defense of what he has experienced against those who have not themselves experienced what he has experienced. The defense refers in particular to what Scheffler calls the other, which I mentioned just before. So what happened to the witness and what we have identified above in the case of the Hadith as the Quranically disclosed reality of Muhammad's prophecy. So with the Hadith, the witness wants to convince his listeners, as it were, of something. So this is implicit, this is involved in every testimony, but in a particular way, of course, in Hadith. The fact that the witness wants to convince the audience to which he testified his experience or his truth. So namely, of an event and above all of the meaning of this event in the case of the Hadith, but also of the fact that what is testified to is absolutely significant for all those who feel committed to the same faith. So the Hadith claim to conviction challenges the listeners themselves. Reading the Hadith as a testimony therefore means that being addressed by the Hadith and challenged, not by the Hadith itself, but by the prophetic reality of Muhammad that is addressed in the Hadith and that the listener encounters, as it was encountered by the witness. And this results in a hermeneutical challenge. And here Scheffler again on this. The listener must, as it were, eavesdrop on the testimony's echo of experience. So he must carefully listen. He must try to identify himself with them and to follow in his footsteps, one can say. And on the experience, appeal to the event. If he in turn wants to respond to the event, and thus also make it for himself an object of his consideration and thinking. So the witness does not want to convince the hearers of himself, but of the fact that something has happened to him and has completely taken him over, pushing him, as it were, to testify, because the meaning of this and the significance of what he experienced goes beyond himself and absolutely concerns all people. And here we have described, I would argue, so I'm coming on to the end, the principal task of theological hadith studies. That is to theologically disclose the experience of which the hadith is a testimony, and to make this experience academically intelligible and accessible to Muslims living in a secular and pluralistic context. In other words, theological hadith studies has the task of making the dialogue between Hanzala and Abu Bakr a dialogue which can be understood by Muslims today as something meaningful and existentially relevant, as a dialogue they can experience themselves, In this way, the hadith can be disclosed as a resource for Islamic theology as an academic discipline. It can understand why and how the hadith still plays such an important role in Muslim life. Despite the objections and reservations one repeatedly hears or reads about. This presentation has tried to show that one explanation for the lasting significance of the hadith could lie in the fact that the hadith is a testimony, namely the testimony of an experience that is common, in fact, to every Muslim in one way or another. It is the experience of the prophetic reality and the prophecy of Muhammad, testified so clearly in the hadith of Hanzala. It is the experience of the prophetic call to God, which is addressed in the Hadith, and which still speaks to Muslims today and challenges them in their faith. And Hadith studies and Islamic theology should have something to say about it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Vimercati, for this interesting and new approach to Hadith studies, Hadith as testimony in Islamic theology. And now we have time for questions online or in room. If someone have any questions. Okay, Bisnik?
Only no one has raised their hand online.
No one.
So I have a question, so the technical question really there, and this is in many ways a very exciting intervention, because in many ways it seeks to kind of reshuffle the terms of debate on Hadith studies in Western academia. And so by its very definition, it's a challenge in many ways to somehow recalibrate the field, where Hadith was on the receiving end of an uphill, always being apologetic and trying to prove itself. And in a way, what I find very interesting here is the different registers of truth that you introduce here. In a way, it reminded me somehow when the late Sayyid al-Bouti, when he writes about the Sira, he speaks about the objective method and the scientific method. That's two very different methods. So that is exciting on its own, but on a very technical aspect. There is this hadith, I believe it was from Abdullah bin Amr al-As in the lecture of Ibn Abdul, where the companion asks for permission to record the hadiths in different states of the Prophet. And then there is an argument made within modern Muslim thought that cites prominent companions who prohibited the recording of hadiths. And the traditional kind of explanation for that has been that the hadith, the collection of the hadith in the early stages of the formation of the prophetic community somehow risked this textual amalgamation between the Quran and the hadith. But that has been used to make the case that somehow hadith in itself has become overbearing over the Sunnah. Now, of course, the problem with that claim is that then the question arises, then what is the Sunnah? Especially a Sunnah that assumes in the mind of this speakers to be liberated from hadith. So not only in light of this account by the Sahabi, but how would you kind of speak to the concerns of the early Muslims about hadith and about the collection of hadith in terms of testimony, in terms of hadith as an account of revelation, not only of the historical event, which is the case that you put and elaborated, so in such a lucid way. Yes. I don't know that question.
Yes, I believe so. So of course, the hadith as we know it today is product of an historical process, and there have been discussions at the very beginning, right? After the death of the Prophet. You can read the whole formative history of Islam in this way, and how to find a solution for the fact that the Prophet is not there anymore, and how to preserve the Sunnah and make it accessible, and especially in the context of the establishment of the Muslim empire, okay, and the fact that Islam was not anymore confined to the Arabian culture and society, but that it expanded in different cultures, in different languages, etc. So the hadith was only one solution actually to this problem, and it is the solution which, at least for Sunni Islam, has with the time become, I mean, the most representative one, let's say for the or as representation for the Sunnah. And as you know, probably there have been a lot of debate in formative period, especially in the context of fiqh, okay, of normative thought, which place this textual testimony should have, you know, as an evidence for norms. And there have been various positions. So it was only after some time that the hadith acquired, I mean, this role of, you know, of principal source of the Sunnah. And you know, there have been this debate with Mu'tazilite theology on the question whether this system of transmission based on the isnad, on the criticism of, or on the trustworthiness of the transmitter, and not rather on the content of the hadith, whether this is a reliable way, you know, of preserving the Sunnah. So of course there have been many discussions, many debates, many divergent positions on the question whether the hadith or which significance or which place the hadith should have as source of the Sunnah. But in all these cases, there has always been an understanding, I think, that the hadith is a testament, is a transmitted testament. And however, the worth of this transmitted testimony, which by the way was transmitted, as you know, in the beginning only orally and only more lately and as a written document, because for us today, as we are living, you know, in a bureaucratic culture, the written word, I mean, it's much stronger than the oral word. Okay, and this for us is natural, but we have to understand that in, let's say, in pre-modern times, I would say, and especially in late antiquity, it was actually quite the contrary. There was a mistrust in many milieux towards written documents, and the oral transmission from person to person was evaluated as yes, more authentic, especially more strong, okay, and as of a stronger quality and trustworthiness. So in any way, despite these discussions and even the contemporary discussions you alluded to the question, is the hadith actually a trustful or a reliable source of the Sunnah? There has been in the formative period, I think, an understanding of testimonial nature, and the discussion was rather what place should this type of thought have, okay, within a normative, a dogmatic context, etc. So what is the relation between the practice, for example, of the people of Medina, just to cite the most known example, or the practice, or the idea of a certain type of theology based on a rational understanding of revelation, of reality. And what changed in the modern discussion is that I think the testimonial nature of hadith was not recognized anymore, or was considered in post-enlightenment especially, as a minor form, a minor source of knowledge, and that in this way, or as a consequence, even in contemporary Islam, there was this attempt to modify the nature of the hadith, to not make it a testament, transmit a testament anymore, but a different source of knowledge, which is empirically, which you can prove somehow in almost as you prove a law of physics or of chemistry, or at least which fulfill the requirement of authenticity as they have been determined in modern historical science. So this, I think that what I try to show is by the way, because you stated at the beginning that it's not an approach which seeks to be in opposition to the approach of Islamic studies or of classical Hadith scholarship, but to be, to provide an additional view, perspective, which until now, because of the reasons I tried to explain, has not been considered, and which leads, which biases our academic understanding of Hadith. I think in academia, we don't have yet really understood what the Hadith is about. And, or we have only partly understood it. We have only understood some aspect of it, which are important. I'm not denying it, but there is something missing, and there's a need for an additional way which mediates, to try to explain, especially between a purely confessional way of considering Hadith, which is concerned with the transmission, basically, with the transmission, with the preservation of the Sunnah, and an approach which is based on assumptions, which of course are very different from the assumptions from which the transmission of Hadith is practiced and is understood.
Okay. Do we have any questions online? Haben Sie Fragen? Okay, maybe I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, this approach seems to me to be very interesting, but maybe someone will come and say, okay, if I understand this concept or this perspective on Hadith, it seems like this approach didn't consider the problem of the authenticity of the Hadith, which discussed in the modern time and in the classical Hadith studies, because it seems like to be conservative in this way. If we see Hadith as a testimony and we missed this problem of authenticity, how can we bring both of them together?
Yes, it's a very important question. I think you're right. I didn't address the question of the, let's say, of the authenticity of the testimony exactly, because this is the question I think which comes afterwards. I tried to clarify the conditions or the presuppositions under which the question of authenticity can be raised in a more meaningful manner, or in a manner which respects the testimonial nature of Hadith. And of course, the problem always remains. I mean, the fact that you consider the Hadith as a transmitted testimony does not wipe away the problem of authenticity. And it does not wipe away it if you consider it from a point of view of Islamic studies or of theology or even classical Hadith science. Of course, the problem remains. But I think that it allows to consider this problem in a way which corresponds to what the Hadith claims to be. So, especially theologically claims to be. So, for example, the question of testimony, every testimony, what does the testimony require as trust? So this is the category which is determining for the notion of testimony. So the question is, and this is an important topic in fact for contemporary theology, religious science, or even anthropology, the question of trust. Okay, we are, I mean, there are many analyses, we are in the crisis of trust today. People don't trust anymore politics, they don't trust media, they don't trust religion, etc. So this is a problem, I think, or let's say, by understanding the Hadith as testimony, this allows Hadith to consider it, you know, not as a specific, you know, problem within Islamic studies and its history, but as a thing which is part of society today. You know, you can work on this problem of authenticity in an interdisciplinary way, and you can understand it, I think, better in the sense that in testimony, the question of trust is always a question which is culturally and historically determined. The conditions, okay, in which trust is responsible are not the same in different cultures, of course, in different times. Okay, so in different societies, every society has a way of defining under which conditions trust is responsible and under which conditions trust is justified. So, of course, I mean, this makes the question of authenticity maybe more complicated than resolving it. But that's to say that the notion of, or the approach of considering Hadith as testimony does not seek to ignore this question of authenticity, but rather to integrate it into a wider, you know, a wider view of the problem, and also in a view which is meaningful to Muslim life today, you know, and especially in the West, where we practice academic theology. And then the question is, of course, what role should play historical criticism, as you have different forms, by the way, in Islamic studies? What role should play the classical method of criticism? And this is something I think which we will have to work on in the future. But I would argue that we can work on this only in a meaningful way if we consider Hadith as testimony, if we start, if we respect and not ignore the testimonial nature of Hadith and all that it implies. Because only then, just the last sentence, we can understand that the question of authenticity is not only a question of authenticity in a positivist sense. I mean, in the sense of a historical factuality. Okay, because as Ruggero, for example, explained very well, a religious testimony is also about confessing a meaning. So authenticity is also means this meaning which is confessed, authentic in the sense. Does it represent the prophetic reality in the sense? Does it express in a way this prophetic reality which creates resonance in the one who hears it, and or which provides orientation for Muslims, prophetic orientation. Okay, so I think this would be a fruitful way, you know, to consider to think of this question of authenticity. And I think Islamic studies and classical Hadith sciences can take profit of it and of a theological Hadith study in this sense. Okay. Mhm.
Cannot find will be when that can so I
Yeah, yeah. I think this is an important aspect. I mean, I couldn't really talk about this, but the theological nature of hadith, because as you rightly say, there's a witness and the prophet, and even if the dialogue is not verbally expressed, okay, there's a form of relationship of interaction, which forms the core of hadith, actually. Okay, I mean, the hadith is generated by the interaction, by the dialogical encounter, in fact. Okay, but then I don't know what you mean with dialectical dialogue. I mean,
image, because most of them are the questions and the concepts of Muslims. And then the prophet answered. Again, they
Yes.
translate.
Yes, yes.
I think because followers,
Mhm. Mhm.
then they was in some way maybe change. But
Okay, that's
in the mind,
I understand what you mean. Okay, I understand. Yeah, this is something actually I wanted to talk about it in the conclusion, but time was not enough. There's a notion which tries to explain this, and that is the innovatory speech act. That is, I mean, this is used in New Testament studies, but I think it's interesting for Hadith also. That is that considering the Hadith as a speech act in the sense that the Hadith or the testimony, let's say, seeks to have an effect. But I say, to come to your example more closely, if the prophet speaks to somebody, what is the effect of the speech on this person? Okay, what is the impact? Let's say the impact of the speech on this person, and this notion of innovatory speech act tries to show that the impact of a text like the New Testament, or I think also of Hadith, is to change the, let's say, the worldview of this person. I mean, to have a deep existential impact. It's not only an ordinary dialogue about, well, the weather is nice today, etc. So it's something which is deeply affecting the person. Okay, so the dialogical partner, if you want, in the sense that the aim of the prophetic word, because it is, I mean, if you consider the traditional view based, or it is a result of revelation or inspiration, is to somehow, let's say, to transform the person, okay, in a way that it orients the person, or let's say, as we saw in the Quranically disclosed or described reality of prophecy. Prophecy is a call to God. Okay, so to call this person to God, let's say, to make it simple, and how the prophetic word or action tries to have this impact. Okay, how this and how in Hadith this is visible. Okay, so how the event which is testified in the Hadith shows that the witness is somehow yes, transformed by this, in the sense that it changes. I mean, the witness is not the same person before and after he spoke to the Prophet. There's something which happened. And what happened? Okay, and how the Hadith witnesses this, what happened. And how this what happened should happen to the person who reads the Hadith now. Okay, so this notion, I think, which could be interesting to explore as well, but which is also based on the notion of testimony, and which implies the dialogue, of course.
Any questions from Zoom? Okay, Osama Gauji. Okay, Osama, you can ask now.
Great picture. The ideas were very brilliant and inspirational, actually. And it opens up many topics maybe to discuss about this testimonial nature of Hadith. So I have some points which I would like to hear your opinion about, and I have maybe questions. But let's start with the last point you mentioned, the acts of the words of the Prophet. For example, al-Hadith al-Musalsal, that has to be transmitted in the same way. Maybe let us to understand a further idea about the Hadith, that it's not only transmitting testimony, but also it makes the listener lives the experience again. So if Prophet Muhammad said to Mu'adh, "Inni uhibbuk," and Prophet Muhammad said that for the Tabi, and everyone said that in the same way, you have to felt it in the same way. And maybe that will expand the nature of the testimony in the Hadith. I was thinking about why a witness will testify in the history of Hadith transmission. I'm sorry, I'm babysitting the baby, and it chose the perfect time to wake up now. But anyway, why a companion will testify a Hadith? For example, we have different stories to understand the situation. There is a testimony under demand, and maybe under there's a need to transmit the Hadith, and many companions didn't really voluntarily testify what they hear from the Prophet Muhammad, unless there was a case that need their specific knowledge, and there's no other one to testify. On the other hand, the case of Abu Huraira, for example, shows us the voluntarily testimony that he sits and he transmits the Hadith. There is a special case that I want to ask you about, because you mentioned that the transmitters are testify also the prophetic nature in the report, in the Hadith. But the case of al-Hadith al-Mawquf, the companion report, that has the hukm al-marfu', they say, that he's talking about something he wouldn't know unless it was heard from the Prophet Muhammad. In this case, the companion is transmitting the prophetic knowledge, but without attributing it to the Prophet. In the terms of testimonial nature of the Hadith, how do you understand that?
I must say I didn't understand everything because of the acoustic problems, but I will try to answer. Yes, I think here again, this is an example where the notion of testimony can be useful. The first thing you mentioned, I mean, the performative aspect of hadith transmission, which is also very interesting, which I didn't address here because I was concentrating on the textual nature of the hadith. But then the second point about the question of Mahfuz, etc. I mean, this is a little bit the same also with the question of riwayah bil mana or riwayah bil lafz. You know, the transmission with the what how you say? I mean, the verbal, the exact verbal expression or the transmission of the sense, okay, of what the Prophet said or did. And it's interesting to know that there was a discussion at the beginning, okay, if there should be the criteria that only those hadiths who for which we can be sure that they express the exact words of the Prophet, that only these hadiths should be accepted, or whether a riwayah bil mana, okay, is accepted. So there was a discussion, but the outcome was that someone like Hassan al-Basri said that if we would accept only those hadiths for which we are sure that they express the exact wording of the Prophet, there would be very few hadiths, actually. And the fact that a riwayah bil mana, with very strict conditions, of course, but was accepted, shows very well the testimonial nature of hadith, I would say. Okay, because testimony doesn't necessarily mean, okay, the reproduction, let's say, of the exact words, even if this is the ideal, okay, of which everybody seeks to obtain, of course. Okay, I mean, this is the best case, but this is not a condition, okay, to consider a hadith a valid source for the sunnah. And this is interesting. This shows, of course, the primordial role of the Sahaba, and also of the first three generations, okay, which actually were responsible for the hadith, okay, we were at the origin actually of the hadith, okay. So that this is what I was saying also about this theological idea that the time of the Prophet and of the first generation has a special quality of which you can explain theologically, okay, of course, but you cannot consider it, of course, from a point of view of Islamic study. So this shows that the testimony is not only of the event in the sense of the saying, so of reporting the exact saying, but it's also about the meaning of this event. Okay, so this is so if the meaning is testified in a valid way, and who decides this? I mean, this is the community who decides. Okay, and in the sense, or let's say the representatives of the community, which in this case were the first generations and its most authoritative representatives, and later the ulama, the hadith specialists. So if a testimony is considered to be a valid representation of the sunnah, okay, in the sense of confessing also the meaning of the event, and if the alfaz of the hadith, if the words of the hadith express this meaning in a way which is theologically meaningful and valid and in conformity to revelation, to the prophetic mission, to the Quran, of course, then it is accepted. And this you can understand, I think, only. I mean, you can only really understand it if you consider hadith as the testimony. Because if you consider it as a historical document or as a report of an event, etc., that the hadith should be of a lower value, let's say, or even maybe not accepted. And this is a problem which you see in contemporary discussions, where there is this idea sometimes that hadith must express or represent the exact words of the Prophet. This is something which, you know, in public discussions or something you hear very often, but which even classical hadith scholars wouldn't agree with. Why? Because the hadith is a testimony and it's not a historical document. I don't know if you answered your question, because I didn't really understood everything.
No, that's great and informative. Thank you.
Okay, I think we came to the end of the time. Thank you very much for participation in our lecture today. And next week, we will have Professor Jonathan Brown on Tuesday at 6 o'clock, and he will speak about the current challenges of Hadith studies. And we hope to see you again, inshallah, next week. Assalamu alaikum.